The Economist.
From London, this is The Economist. I'm James Miles, the China editor. Every few weeks, both in print and online, The Economist publishes a special report on a subject or region. In this week's issue, we take a closer look at Singapore, as the country prepares to celebrate its 50th anniversary as an independent nation, and ask whether the Singapore exception that its leaders boast of will endure for another 50 years. The author of the report, Simon Long, joins me in our London studio to discuss. Simon, what is the Singapore exception and why should its leaders worry about it right now?
Well, Singapore is exceptional in a number of ways, if you think about it. It is the last functioning city-state in the world, for one thing. But perhaps more fundamentally, it is the only rich country, and it is one of the world's richest countries in terms of per capita GDP. It is the only one never to have changed its ruling party. The ruling party, the People's Action Party, has been in power since before its birth as an independent nation in 1965, since 1959, in fact, when it first won self-governance from Britain. So that is remarkable, and it is an exceptionalism that is based on a sense of extreme vulnerability. In 1965, when it was expelled from the Malaysian Federation, Singapore seemed unlikely to survive. Lee Kuan Yew, the present Prime Minister's father, who was its founding leader, had once called the idea of an independent Singapore an economic, political and geographic absurdity. The idea that as a city alone with no hinterland, with no natural resources, it could survive and flourish, it seemed improbable. That sense of vulnerability, of fragility, remains very much part of Singapore's psyche today and explains quite a lot of its policies.
And recent politics, too, has unnerved the government a little, perhaps, insofar as in the elections in 2011, the PAP, the ruling party, suffered a little bit of a setback anyway. For a one-party system, it was perhaps uncomfortable to see an opposition beginning to gain a voice.
It was its worst performance since 1965. One has to put this in perspective. It still won 60% of the votes. Well, that meant that it won over 90% of the seats. So its power is not in any sense under any immediate threat. But you're right. Instead of, as it were, figuratively shrugging its shoulders and saying, what do you expect? We've been in power 50 years. Of course, people are going to be a little disillusioned with us. It did take it as a rebuke and engaged in what it called a national conversation, which was a kind of island-wide focus group exercise of talking to people and seeing what their concerns were, and discovered that people were disgruntled, particularly about issues of public transport and immigration and housing, all related, that there were too many people coming in, public transport was getting crowded, property prices were going up, and that this was creating a sense of resentment against them, which they have since tried to address in a number of ways. So it's expected that there will be an election not long after these celebrations, and many people, I think, expected to do rather better this time, but it was a moment when it saw that its power may not endure indefinitely.
But it's also about people complaining, as you suggest, about the very fundamentals of Singapore's economy and how, for example, instead of a fully fledged welfare state, housing has been used as a way of keeping people happy. And yet this itself is now becoming a key part of people's grievances.
I wouldn't say it was a grievance, but I'd say it is becoming part of the fundamental problem that, yes, Singapore has always rejected the idea of welfarism as seen in, for example, Europe. But it has, in a way, transferred enormous amounts of wealth to most of its population through a combination of a compulsory savings scheme and housing benefits. People are forced to save a large chunk of their salaries. At the moment, 20% of their own pay packet and a further 17% contributed by their employer goes into a central provident fund. They can then borrow against that to buy publicly built housing. And 80% of Singaporeans now own their own or are in owner-occupied, publicly built flats. However, what it doesn't necessarily give them is cash. And as they reach retirement, they're finding that there's not enough money left in their savings for them to have the comfortable retirement that they thought they had been promised. And that is leading to a certain sense of resentment. So two of the pillars of Singapore's success, its savings scheme and its housing scheme, are indeed becoming, as it were, part of the problem.
The country's economy continues to develop reasonably, by rich country standards, reasonably well. Should it worry about its low productivity, its inability in some respects to move as fast up the value chain of production that it would like?
Well, in manufacturing, it has moved very successfully up the value chain. The problem seems to be particularly in its service industries, that you're right, that productivity has become a focus of government concern. And because Singaporeans have not been having children, it has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, as low as anywhere, except perhaps Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, some other East Asian examples. Because it's not having enough babies, that means large numbers of immigrants are coming in. And that is another source of resentment. It leads to rising population, it leads to a sense that locals are being crowded out of employment and housing by immigrants, and that is causing resentment against the ruling party, and is why there is this intense focus on raising productivity at the moment, because productivity has to be the main source of growth in a small, finite island where there is not that much room for many more people.
It has been joked that one reason for Singapore's success is that it is so far from China, a country which looks to it as a model, and yet of course enjoys all the benefits of a close relationship with China. Do you think that its role as a model for China is one that's going to make a difference in the years ahead?
Well, one of Singapore's great successes, and it's one that can be ascribed in large measure to the views and personality of Lee Kuan Yew, its founding prime minister, has been to be both China's best friend in Southeast Asia in many ways and America's best friend in Southeast Asia. I think the threat to its relations with China comes more from the tension inherent in that triangular relationship than in any political change at home. But I think increasingly Singapore, like other nations in the region, will find itself forced to choose in a way it finds uncomfortable between America and China. We have seen this recently with Singapore's ignoring America's entreaties not to join the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We've seen it with it ignoring China's views to host American littoral combat ships. So I think that may be more of a threat, that we may see more tensions between Singapore and China because of its close ties with America rather than because of its political system.
And that sense of national identity was evident, wasn't it, when the founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, died recently? There were great expressions of national mourning over that, a transitional period of great importance for Singaporeans. Will we see that sort of mood on display during the 50th anniversary? Yes,
I think so. I think in a sense that will carry on, that it was, for many Singaporeans, in the week after Lee Kuan Yew died, it sort of built up. At first, the reaction was quite muted on the streets and elsewhere because his death, after all, had been long anticipated. He had been in intensive care for weeks by that stage. And at first, people sort of shrugged and carried on. But through the week, and as his body was moved from first the Istana, the presidential palace, to the parliament, and people queued up for overnight and for hours and hours to file past the coffin. And yes, it was partly out of grief at his passing, partly out of respect for what he had achieved in Singapore, but also, I think you're right, it was a celebration of an improbable patriotism, that 50 years ago when Singapore was born, it was not meant to be a country. It was a country by accident. It was expelled from Malaysia. Its own leader, Lee Kuan Yew, had not thought of it as a country, and yet it had forged national identity, and people were celebrating that. And I think we will see that as well at the SG50 parade.
Simon Long, thank you very much. That's all for this episode. You can read the full special report both in the upcoming print issue of The Economist and online at economist.com. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.